I'd like to welcome you all to the final installment of our summer talk series here at the New School for Social Research. We've titled the talk series, The Current Moment, Perspectives from the Social Sciences and Humanities, with the idea that our faculty here at the NSSR already work on a number of issues that are relevant to the current moment, and we thought this would provide a perfect forum to showcase that work and discuss it with the public audience. I'm Zed Adams, chair of the philosophy department here at the NSSR. And I'd like to welcome three visitors today. But before I introduce them, I want to heartily thank a number of people at the NSSR who have made this possible. This was very much a team effort. The series was co-conceived by myself and Robert Krisheva, vice dean at the NSSR. And he really took it from an idea that came up in a meeting to an actual event that we're now part of. Kirill Klavev, Associate Director of Academic Affairs, played an essential role in setting up the webinars and handling all of the kind of background tech involved in that, and he's been a great help. Sherry Cohen, the Director of Communications, did an amazing job advertising the series, and I think she's to be credited with the wonderful attendance we've had to these events. Philip Coleman in IT made sure everything ran smoothly, and hopefully today he'll keep his record of having everything run perfectly today. And finally, I'd like to thank Miranda Young, who was my co-host, a PhD student in the philosophy department, who was able to join us for so many of these wonderful discussions. That said, I'm going to welcome the three participants today and then turn it over to them. So we have Cinzia Arruzza, who's an associate professor of philosophy in the NSSR. She works on ancient philosophy and contemporary political thought, and is the co-author of many things, or the author of many things, and the co-author most recently of Feminism for the 99%. Miriam Ticktin is associate professor of anthropology. Miriam works on many things, but one thing I was struck by in reading some of her work for this meeting was how she's really interested in the philosophical presuppositions of universal claims to humanity, as well as their political implications. And so I hope that will come up today in the discussion. And finally, I'd like to welcome Justin Charles, who's an alumnus of the New School. He got his Bachelor in Science from the Media Studies Department and his MFA in Design and Technology at Parsons. He's taught at Parsons, and he's now part of the leadership of the DSA NYC and one of the organizers of hashtag Defund NYPD. So thank you all for joining. I'm gonna turn off my video and let you all take over, and then you won't see me again until the Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Zed. So I will begin, and I will begin by saying, first of all, that I'm really honored to be in a panel with Miriam and Justin. And I will also try to really keep my intervention short so that they may have some more time. And I also wanted to begin by mentioning the fact that since we are discussing about police and prison abolitionism, mentioning the fact that NYPD brutally attacked the queer liberation demonstration yesterday. So we had yet another instance of unjustified repression and police brutality. So what I would really want to do in in 7-8 short minutes is to try to contextualize the current Black rebellion, anti-racist rebellion, within what I may call the immediate context, a more medium-term political and social context, and a long-term context, which is the long trajectory of Black liberation struggles in the United States. Why I want to do this? First of all, because I hope that Miriam and Justin will go more into the details of especially Justin, of the mobilizations and how they are taking place. And I thought it may be useful to think about the complexities of the current protest, starting from precisely a gaze on the context. So what, in other words, looking at the protest not as an individual event, which came out of nowhere, but rather situating it within both its immediate context, but also more long-term trajectories. So the immediate context always, obviously, is the pandemic. So in other words, and the fact that the pandemic has somehow made more transparent a set of social and political contradictions that are predicated upon institutionalized racism and anti-Blackness. And this was particularly visible in the contradiction, let's say, between the homage formally paid to mostly racialized essential workers, the ones who kept us all alive during months of lockdown, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the rate of mortality, which is still much more higher for Black and Latino people, combined with police brutality. So so state brutality, state violence against the very people on whose work and on whose help we all as a society depended very clearly during the pandemic. So I think the pandemic contributed enormously to the explosion of the protest, not only in terms of the exacerbating and making transparent some deep-seated social and political contradictions, but also in more positive terms in basically facilitating the emergence of a whole infrastructure of mutual aid that worked as a concrete support to the protests and to the struggles on the streets and so on. And maybe in the debate we can go more into this aspect, very interesting aspect of the protest. So in terms of medium-term context, I do think that it would be useful to look at the current Black and Brown rebellion as an anti-racist struggle, as a moment, as an absolutely important moment within a longer arch of polarization and political radicalization that has taken place not only in the United States, but globally. And that has begun at the beginning of the last decade. So in other words, we need to, in order to understand some aspects of the current rebellion, we need to look at the the decade-long trajectory of mass protest and struggles that have somehow pointed to a process of increasing radicalization. So for reasons of time, I can only, let's say, allude to this, but let's think about the trajectory from Occupy, Taksim Square, the Arab revolutions, the movement of the Indignados, so early 2000s, and Black Lives Matter in 2015, the Chilean revolt, the struggle of Standing Rock, the rebellion in Hong Kong, the strike wave in the United States with, by the way, the very important participation of Black women, Black teachers, Fridays for Future, and obviously the huge, massive new feminist wave. So in other words, the current rebellion, the way I would like us to try to think about it is not just an immediate response to yet another act of aggression and violence and murder by the police of a Black person. It is also part and parcel of a process of increasing radicalization and we could say repoliticization of society, which is happening not only in the United States, but around the globe. And this is very important to note because we also have a very interesting phenomenon of cross-contamination and cross-influence in terms of forms of struggle, languages used, forms of communication, and so on. Just to make an example, the encampment in our very city, a city hall, which obviously echoes the experience not only of the Occupy, but also the Arab revolutions, which was predicated upon the occupation of public spaces, and obviously Taksim Square. The last more longer term contextualization I want to operate has to do obviously with the long trajectory of Black struggles in the United States. And I don't have the time to really say much about this, but I want to focus on one aspect that I think represents some of the most powerful features of the history of Black resistance and Black struggle in this country. And this is particularly visible, in my view, in the tradition of Black feminism, which, by the way, has played an incredibly important role, not only in Black Lives Matter in 2015, but it has played an incredibly important role in the feminist wave as a whole, in terms of elaboration, in terms of the political horizon that offers to a new mass of newly radicalized women, young women and queer people. Now, the aspect I want to focus on is, just mentioned, is the ability throughout the history of Black liberation, the ability of universalizing without losing the particular. So I'm going to explain this in different terms. So and this is particularly visible, again, for me within Black feminism. So starting from the analysis of a specific form of oppression, a specific instance or axis of oppression, the ability to expand this analysis into an analysis of the whole of social relations, the way in which society works as a whole, and therefore the ability to actually use somehow like the struggle, or to transform the struggle for Black liberation into a struggle for the transformation of society as a whole. Now, this is, for me, particularly evident in the trajectory of Black feminism, and this also explains, is one of the reasons that explain, in my view, why Black feminism is so influential for the new feminist way around the globe, precisely because it offered this, let's say, alternative way of universalizing. So rather than losing the particular, rather than thinking that we should not care about specific forms of oppression, it starts from the analysis and the attack against a specific form of oppression to show the interconnection between this form of oppression and the way in which society works as a whole. What are the social relations that support society as a whole? A second instance, and I will finish here because I think Justin has more interesting things to say than me about this. The second feature, the second instance in which we can see this power, this incredible capacity, is precisely the perspective of abolitionism, prison and police abolitionism, where from the specific issue of the industrial prison complex and of police brutality, in particular the entrenched institutionalized racism of police in the United States, it becomes also a perspective that actually asks us to transform the way in which we produce, the way in which we consume, the way in which we are together, our political institutions as a whole, and so on. So in other words, precisely because we cannot achieve police and prison abolitionism within capitalist social relations, then prison abolitionism, the perspective of abolitionism becomes let's say one of the a fundamental attack point, or a fundamental point of attack against capitalist relations as a whole. I will finish here in order not to steal time again from the panel, but I do think that it is this capacity, this power, this is also what explains, what contributes to explain the mass dimension that the current Black-led rebellion had, and how it really managed to somehow completely change, at least for a few weeks, the political discourse, political perceptions, and even reopening a future for all of us. We 3 months of pandemic had somehow blocked the future from our sides, or at least certainly from mine. I was living in a suspended time. And this protest had the ability to reopen in the future, not only for Black and brown people, but I think for everybody who's actually interested in working towards a better society. So I will close here, and I think leave the, I think Justin is coming next.
Thank you, Cinzia. Hello, everybody. I'm It's a pleasure to be on a panel at my alma mater. So Cinzia talked about some of this, but when the pandemic hit, it quickly exposed the many ways our political and economic systems leave most of us behind. Our hospital system was stretched to the breaking point, with healthcare workers unable to get the personal protective equipment that they needed. We've ended up with record unemployment. Some of us have been, have had the luxury of being able to work safely from home, but many of us in this city haven't had that luxury, and we've had to put ourselves at risk, every day to keep the city running. And many of those essential workers are overwhelmingly Black and brown. And as the city became the epicenter of the virus, we also saw a disproportionate rate of infection and deaths in Black and brown communities. Not only that, we saw disproportionate rates of violent police enforcement of social distancing against Black and brown New Yorkers. Within that context, then, George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin. So when I heard about George Floyd, I expected that a few things would happen. I expected the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota would cover for yet another killer cop lynching yet another Black man. I expected more thoughts and prayers from our political establishment. I expected empty, toothless reforms or calls for those that would, basically allow officers like Derek Chauvin to keep doing what they were doing because they were just going to ignore those reforms anyway. What I didn't expect, though, was, within the context of a pandemic, we've all been, isolated in our homes for the most part. An uprising, in Minneapolis, unlike anything I've ever seen, in my life, a police precinct, burned to the ground. I didn't expect then that uprising to trigger a chain of protests and rebellions in cities all over the country that have managed to sustain themselves for weeks. I also didn't expect that, my not at all radical friends would start asking about and saying words like defund and abolish in reference to the police. So the origins of policing in this country, I think, tell us, what it's still for today. As northern cities industrialized and ran largely immigrant working class, communities ragged, labor had to be kept in line. As the frontier expanded westward and native land was taken, that stolen land then needed to be held violently from Native Americans and Mexicans. In the South, enslaved Africans and their descendants had to be kept from escaping or from rebelling. All of this for the maintenance of a social order. So you have the wrangling of labor, the acquisition of the means by which wealth is created, the protection of that wealth. All of these done by whatever brutality was necessary. That's the origin of policing in this country. Today, we have this, what we call the prison industrial complex, which includes not only police and prisons themselves, but also jails, bail, parole, immigration enforcement agencies, detention centers, mental health care, or really facilities that are quite coercive, mass media, nonprofits, politicians, any number of businesses servicing all of these things, kind of reinforcing this prison industrial complex. So the movement for abolition of police and prison seeks to not just, rid our society of these institutions, but to fundamentally change the conditions which brought them into being. Not only that, it's a lens through which we can understand the world, and also a daily practice of building and strengthening communities of care, of kind of creating the way in which that we get free as a society, I'd say. So in practice, abolition is about both chipping away at these, oppressive structures, structures, focused on punishment and social control, and trying to build thriving communities that eliminate the root causes of what we call crime, and develop new ways of responding to harm. So it's not just subtractive, it's additive. We want to be rid of the prison industrial complex. We want to do it tomorrow, but it won't happen tomorrow. Abolition is a horizon, and the way that we move toward that horizon is through diminishing the power of police and prison over our lives, and through building alternatives, in the here and now. So how do we diminish that power of police and prisons? Surprisingly, you hear a word like abolition, you think about something a little bit more revolutionary, but I think it's not in opposition to reform. And I'm not talking about the kind of reforms we generally see when cops kill Black people on videotape and people get upset about it. I'm not talking about body cameras or technological non-solutions, or training or whatever else. The kind of reforms I'm talking about have to do the following. They have to reduce funding to police and prisons. They have to challenge the notion that police and prisons increase our safety as a society. They have to reduce the tools, tactics, technology that police have at their disposal. They have to reduce the scale of policing in prisons. Any reform that doesn't do those four things is not a transformative reform. It's not abolitionist. The kinds of reforms I'm talking about are things like removing police from schools and hospitals, ending pretrial detention, the decriminalization of sex work, homelessness, street economies, ending the coordination between ICE and any other immigration enforcement and the police, and ending in general the criminalization of immigration. It means closing jails and not building new ones. It means disaffiliating police unions and disbanding them, disaffiliating from bodies like the AFL-CIO. It means ending the use of surveillance technology, ways in which we're kind of made to police ourselves. It means disarming the police. Police in other countries don't have armored personnel carriers and things like that. It means something that doesn't necessarily sound like reform of the prison industrial complex, but I think providing social services. It means providing housing and healthcare and education for our communities. And it means defunding the police. So this brings me to the kind of current fight that we're in. And I think what's been different about this moment is that normally when the police kill somebody, we hear a lot of outrage, and we want punishment for these police, which is understandable. And yeah, I'm hearing some of that, but I think what's different, I think, about this time, I think I'm hearing a lot more, and I think some of this has to do with the fact that contextually we had just had kind of, the rock lifted up, and we kind of saw, everything in our society that doesn't work because of the pandemic. People are talking about root causes. They're talking about, okay, why does this keep happening? And the root cause being, I think, the place we give policing in our society. And that goes back to the funding. New York is perhaps a particularly glaring example of police overfunding, but this is the case all over the country. And we're beginning to see, not just in New York, but in other cities, demands to defund the police. So in New York, we have a budget for our police of nearly $6 billion. Between 2014 and 2019, police spending has been greater than spending on public health, homeless services, housing, youth and community development, and workforce development, all of those combined. And in the wake of the pandemic, what we're about to see is more budget cuts across the board to programs that have already been underfunded and divested from year after year after year. So Mayor de Blasio put forth a budget. It basically left the police budget untouched. Very, very minor cuts. And we see this happening like all while people are out in the streets protesting. You have police officers kind of decked out in their riot gear, looking like they're, about to attack a castle or something. And then you have, just, a month or two ago, you have nurses, who are wearing trash bags and like reusing their surgical masks and their N95 masks. So I think like when we're talking about safety, we see what society calls safety, and it's people decked out in riot gear beating up protesters versus, people who are trying to keep us healthy that don't have what they need. So the mayor put forth that budget. People give the mayor a hard time, as they rightly should, including the council. The city council then, put forth a competing plan, I think under considerable pressure. So they put out a press release a few weeks ago, City Council Speaker Corey Johnson and other leaders, saying they were prepared to cut the police budget by $1 billion, the 2021 budget, using pretty vague language about where those cuts are going to come from. What folks are now hearing is that what that's going to really amount to is basically like shuffling dollars in the budget around, rather than like cutting, police personnel, the number of officers on the street, basically taking money that's spent on officers in public schools, money that comes from the police budget. That money is going to be moved now to the Department of Education instead, but it's still going to be for officers. This is what has leaked from City Council. I think so. I'm with New York City DSA. I've been part of the group that's been planning our defund campaign, and following the lead of abolitionist leaders, and like Cinzia said, abolition is kind of rooted in radical Black feminism. Miriam and others, say, cut the police budget by half, cut the number of police personnel by half. That's the demand that we're fighting for. There grassroots organizations and NGOs, some support that, but others are going for the at least 1 billion number. I would love to see half. I'd love to see more than half. But being realistic, we don't know what we're gonna get. You might get something closer to the billion. It might be something not that great where they're just moving dollars around, like I just said. This isn't gonna be. This budget's gonna come down. It's supposed to come down tomorrow. It's due tomorrow. It may or may not. It probably will come down tomorrow, but we'll see what happens. This is going to be a fight into the next year when the next budget happens, and we see how much money they're trying to give the police. But my point is, if as a society, if we're saying the priority is we're going to give exorbitant amounts of money to policing, divest from our communities, it tells us what our leaders value, and our leaders, you know, to me that says our leaders don't value us. So I guess the question for people in this movement is, how are we going to make leaders value us? I encourage folks to, you know, look into this. You can go to defundnypd.com to learn more about DSA's part of this work. You could go to City Hall. We've had the City Hall encampment going on, as Cinzia mentioned, where you can learn all about the demands. We've got teach-ins going on on a regular basis. There's also a march going on today, meeting at 5 for a rally at Washington Square Park, and then marching off at 6. So I'm gonna shut up now, and looking forward to hearing from Miriam. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks to Cinzia and to Justin for those fabulous presentations. So I wanted to actually address the question of what does solidarity and collective responsibility mean in this context. So, you know, as Justin, you just laid out so beautifully, abolitionism is not about defunding the police or getting rid of prison. I mean, it is about that. It's not simply about that. It has a long-range vision. You know, it insists on an egalitarian imaginary and a politics of care. So while huge numbers of people are joining in protests and in multiracial coalitions and calling for revolution and not just reform, I've been thinking about the moral and political grammars and structures that we have in place to enable this long-range imagination that abolitionists have called for and are already putting in place. So what are the forms of solidarity and responsibility that are being enacted? And are they helping us toward this alternate vision? So I wanted to point to two dominant responses from the liberal or left-leaning white folks and some non-Black people of color. And here I'm speaking as someone with a brown mother and a white father, and as an immigrant to the US. So I'm implicated in this group in multiple and often conflicting ways. So I'll talk about that and then offer some alternatives. So one response has been to act as allies. So the position says to Black folks, we fully support you and we'll follow your lead. We've learned some of the lessons from coalitional struggles where white people have dominated, and we agree to take a supportive backseat in addressing police violence and systems of inequality. So this is obviously an important step, and you know, it's a critical role that people can play. But there can also be some aspect of this response which effectively also says, this is not our problem. It's your problem, and we will be allies as you solve it. This doesn't take primary responsibility for the fact that this system is in place because of a white supremacist history that everyone who's not Black or Indigenous benefits from in different capacities, to be sure. And of course, I don't mean to erase brownness either, as many folks are caught up in this carceral history. But I think the issue is the distinction between seeing this as primarily a Black problem or a problem of whiteness, and it's a white problem. So the second way liberal white folks and again some non-Black people of color have responded is by jumping on board and performing their own virtuous knowledge about the situation, claiming their anti-racism and identifying with Black folks in ways that actually risk erasing the difference. So as transnational feminist scholar and activist Shireen Razak has written, in relation to the witnessing of pain, particularly in relation to racialized others, identifying with the suffering of the other can too quickly slip into feeling that one has become that sufferer, both erasing the actual people suffering from discrimination and displacing any sense of responsibility towards them. So to me, both of these responses are rooted in the language that dominates our discussions of justice. And this is the binary moralized language of innocence and guilt, one that leaves no room for collective responsibility. So as I'll explain, I think both of those liberal responses claim innocence. And a reliance on innocence as a way to adjudicate relations of power and questions of justice focuses on individuals, on intentions, and direct moralized culpability. So I want to point out one particular understanding of innocence here, one that may feel less familiar, but I think is central to racial formations like racial capitalism. And this is the idea from the etymology, not to know. So innocence is not simply to be empty of knowledge or empty of intention, but to specifically not know. So this can be a willful and aggressive ignorance. You know, the grounding idea here is that how can people who did not know, who did not intend to do harm, to discriminate, be held accountable? They're innocent. The opposite then of innocence here is not guilt, but moral responsibility. So in the context of US history, James Baldwin thought about this kind of willful ignorance or unknowing in the terms of racial or white innocence. And he described this impermissible innocence as Americans' refusal to deal with deeply entrenched forms of racial justice by holding on to ideologies of equality that undergird the American dream rather than facing actual historical evidence. So Baldwin was describing the way Americans want to hold on to the fantasy of a race-blind or color-blind present and future. Their ignorance allows the posture of innocence. Indeed, racial innocence, in this sense, is a form of deflection. It's a not knowing or obliviousness that can be politically useful for those in power and that can prompt and justify further such pursuits of innocence. So it allows white folks to benefit from the system without acknowledging the ways the system operates or their central role in its reproduction. I just want to quote a few lines from Baldwin. He said, "It's not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent." He's talking about white supremacy. "It is the innocence which constitutes the crime." So, you know, abolitionist activists like Ruthie Gilmore and Naomi Murakawa have also pointed out how for some time now the focus on innocence in the criminal justice system simply allows for more people to be deemed criminal and fixes some people as permanently not innocent. So in the two cases of the liberals that I mentioned, racial innocence plays an important role. In the first, the claim to allyship assumes that one stands outside the system as an innocent supporter. But it relies on a denial of one's implication in the system, that even if one's not responsible for putting it in place, one is responsible for maintaining it. In the second case, one claims to know all about racism. And for those of us in the academy, this often involves having studied it, having taught it. But once again, this can be a position of purity, of standing above the fray. It's a claim to superior knowledge, but it plays into racial innocence when it refuses this step beyond knowledge, which is moral responsibility. The reason Baldwin objected so strongly to racial innocence is that the denial of culpability simultaneously forecloses any possibility of equality. So I'm sure we've all heard white liberals say, this isn't primarily about us, we aren't racist, we know better. And this claim to innocence blocks a reckoning with the ways in which one has benefited and continues to benefit from one's positioning in the system. So I want to just mention one now infamous example, and that's Amy Cooper. So we all know that she weaponized her white womanhood to threaten Christian Cooper by saying she would call the police and tell them she was being threatened by an African-American man. But what we must not forget is that she's a white elite liberal. She votes Democratic, and she doesn't consider herself racist. She said that the fallout from the incident had caused her to realize and recognize her privilege as a white woman in America. And while we might say that her claims to ignorance were disingenuous, I would like to say that this is precisely how such forms of unknowing and racial innocence work. Amy Cooper was at once oblivious and extremely cunning. So what other forms of justice and solidarity might we embrace to address the very present afterlives of slavery and colonialism? Of course, reparations is the most important strategy of redistributive justice being put forth right now. And there's so much to say about this, so I'm just going to say that. But as part of that, I think there are other positions available by which to think about relations of power and questions of justice that center collective responsibility, and structural inequality. And I'm just going to go through some of these positions. So for instance, one can think about the idea of implication. We're all implicated in the system, even if differently so. You know, we participate, even if indirectly. There's the idea of structural beneficiaries. So even if one does not create the system, white folks benefit from it and their inherited advantages, right? There are perpetuators, and this is distinguished from perpetrators, right? Perpetuate the system. There are accomplices, people who are complicit in it. There are descendants. And these are all kind of, I think, positions that allow us to take on structural inequality without moralizing about it, without having the defensiveness that comes with positions of guilt. And so we can enact solidarity and responsibility differently in the face of enduring systems of violence, oppression, and inequality. These are the ways in which we can, I think, continue to make Black lives matter. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks everyone. That was wonderful. Let's just jump right into the questions. So I'd also want to encourage you all to ask questions of each other. So, you know, that should be part of the structure of this conversation. But to everybody out there, we have two ways in which you can ask questions. One is to open up the Q&A window on Zoom. There's actually a completely separate Q&A window in addition to everything else Zoom has built into it. And type in the questions there if you'd like to write them out. Or you can just raise your hand and we can call on you and you could speak, you know, your questions. So let's start. I'm going to start with like one question that's been upvoted a lot from Greg. I'll put a kind of twist on it, which is to say that one ironic thing about America in this larger context of debates about funding and defunding is that America's spending on social services is noticeably less than a lot of our, you know, kind of, you know, countries that we tend to compare ourselves to. And so I think Greg's question is to strike right at that issue and say that, you know, police and prisons are cheap, violent substitutes for a robust social welfare state. Bad, but they do perform a function. And so Greg's question is, do we not need to acknowledge this forthrightly and not pretend that there's no such thing as violent crime? I suggest that this indicates that reform has to be in the context of some sort of Green New Deal. Or I guess the suggestion there is like, why aren't we arguing for like increased funding across the board to all of the woefully neglected social services? Who wants to field this question first? Justin, please.
I'll take a stab at it, and then I think maybe some of the other panelists might have something to say about it too. But I mean, I don't think that abolitionists ignore the reality of violent crime. Or, you know, I think many people who call themselves abolitionists have direct experience with violent crime, are survivors of such things. I think what abolitionists say is police and prisons don't necessarily do a great job of actually reducing or dealing with the consequences of violent crime. I mean, I agree. I've read the Usmani article. I think if we had a robust social welfare state, many of the root causes of what we understand as crime would not be. But I think also, you know, I think this is something that Cinzia spoke a little bit about. I think, you know, the broadest brush solution, which would be something like Green New Deal, which would do a whole lot for us across the board economically, I don't think necessarily solves our problem here. I think we need to get out of the left, socialists, progressives, whatever you want to say. We need to get out of this mindset that like the biggest possible solution is just the one, and let's not talk about the particular oppressions and solutions to those things. Because I think you can't there is no default universalism. It has to be built. It has to be built from people's unique particular experiences. And communities of color in this country have unique particular experiences. And not just communities of color, but poor working class white communities in this country have a unique particular experience with the police and police violence and police brutality. And I think dealing with that is one such way to cohere a universal movement for social change. I mean, Gregory says that prisons and police are bad, but they perform a function. I don't know that they perform that function very well, because we now throw police at every social problem that they're not at all well suited to deal with.
This is a screwdriver that's turning out to be very bad at hammering, would be one way of putting one version of one thing you're saying.
Yeah.
Cinzia, it looked like you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I also wanted to just say that I think, I mean, very briefly, I mean, the perspective of abolitionism, at least, you know, as developed, for example, by Rudy Gilmore or Angela Davis, although they have also their differences, but is precisely a perspective that is predicated on the idea that you have to, in order to reach the moment in which you can abolish prison and the police altogether, you need to put in place a set of, you know, social and political transformations that go much, you know, that go really deep into society. And this means, for example, Justin was speaking about defunding and YPD, and this, of course, raises the question: how do we use that money if the city council votes for the funding? So how do we use the money? I would say in an abolitionist perspective, so when we connect, you know, the immediate struggle to the long-term horizon of abolitionism, the idea is precisely that yes, that money should be used in order to replace the kind of, you know, social role badly performed by the police with actual social services of different nature, which are, and by the way, I would say that should especially target Black communities and community of colors who are disproportionately imprisoned. Now, I cannot make the list of, you know, all the beautiful things that could be done, but I would recommend, you know, even just reading interviews with Rudy Gilmore or Angela Davis, one get a sense of the richness of the perspective, in the sense that, you know, we need to, you know, keep the horizon with us of abolitionism, and then figuring out every time we defund police or we disarm it and so on, with what we are replacing this. And this replacement, by the way, doesn't necessarily take the form only of state intervention or state regulated intervention. There is also the whole issue of, you know, self-organized mutual aid, community grounded services and forms of, you know, living in common, you know, caring to the people in need and so on. So the two aspects, let's say, you know, the attack against prisons and police and this component, social transformation, are, I would say, are kept together by abolitionist authors in a very, very productive way. And I think we should keep this kind of literature in mind in the discussion.
Thanks. Miriam, do you have anything on this, or should I?
Yeah, we can move on. I think what they've said.
Okay, good. Let's call on Aaron. Aaron's actually going to ask a question verbally.
Okay, can you all hear me? Great. So I'll ask this broadly of all three of you, and generally the question is sort of how you think both analytically and practically in terms of the kind of concrete steps of politics right now about the articulation between particular struggles in this country and their articulations with more than national structures of power. And in this light, I was thinking about the relationship between the global context that Cinzia offered and the kind of history of policing that Justin offered. One of the things that's been quite striking about watching the protests and the response to them is that in not accidental ways, the police that we see in the streets cracking down on the protests look like forms of policing that have been used all over the world with tremendous support from the US government in techniques of counterinsurgency to kind of shut down other ways of doing and enacting politics everywhere. So once we start to recognize that the police that we are trying to abolish actually has a distinctly colonial, imperialist, global history, then how do we think about sort of the articulation between struggles over the New York City budget and the kind of global projection of imperial power?
Miriam, can I maybe invite you to, do you have a first response to this?
Let me hold on 1 second. Let's see if anybody has.
Okay, I'll come back.
I would like to respond, but I need to think about it for a second. Yeah.
Sure. Justin?
I mean, I think, you know, one example, you know, that I've read of from Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing, is the formation of the Pennsylvania State Police. In many ways was inspired by occupation of the Philippines. That's one example, but I think, you know, Black liberation struggles have understood, somebody I saw in the Q&A mentioned Stokely Carmichael, you know, have understood, I think, the relationship between colonialism, imperialism, and the situation of Black people in the United States from its inception. So I think, and folks like Angela Davis have written and spoken about, you know, the connection between police brutality here in the United States and what we see in Palestine. I think, you know, it's vital that we speak to those connections and discuss, you know, what we see as the same kind of thing. I mean, police forces, you know, go train with the IDF. United States police forces do that. Like, it's important that we keep this in mind, that it's not just a United States problem, that we have our particular ways in which we see it manifest here, but it's part of a broader problem of social control, violent, brutal social control across the world.
Okay, that's great. Miriam.
Okay, thanks. Giving me a moment to think. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I wanted to think about it in relation to, I guess, what Justin had said too, which was the imbrication of course, the police system with the immigration system and ICE, and these are part of a larger global militarized system. So we know all the same military technologies that are used to police people are also the ones that are used to build border walls and to surveil, and you know, the technologies. And these are a kind of a transnational global market. So, you know, I think we can fight on multiple fronts, but one of the things that's happening, I think, that recognizes it as a global and an imperial, has the global and imperial history, is the No Borders movement. And the No Borders movement in particular fights against this militarized system that is being set up around the globe to stop mobility and to stop, to keep poor people in place, right? To stop, to keep the hierarchies of the rich and poor geographically placed and racially placed. So I feel like that is one way that people are already doing incredibly important things to address it both globally and locally. And just on that front, I wanted to say it's you know, to think about the interesting confluence of struggles. You know, you see the fall, of course, of and people pulling down all the statues that represent, you know, Confederate and other racist histories. I think one of the things that we need to do, and I'm following on a friend and scholar who said this, is that one of the biggest monuments to kind of racial hierarchy and racial capitalism is the border wall, and we have to pull that down. Now, you know, that's part of that same struggle.
I like that. Let's turn to another question from the Q&A. Neil has a great question about the role of unions in the rebellion. And I wonder if we could, you know, talk about both the role of the, you know, police unions in, you know, preventing police from being held accountable for the murders, But also, is there any role for a positive, presence in the rebellion on the part of trade unions? Cinzia, can we start with you on that question?
Yes. So on the issue of police unions, I would say this is actually a major part of the problem. So in other words, unfortunately, police unions have worked in a way as to basically block any attempt at accountability for police officers who have murdered or brutalized Black and brown people. And one of the big problems is that within a labor movement that in the United States is particularly weak, because we have one of the lowest rate of unionization in the world. So within this context, the presence of really large police unions within the labor movement itself creates all sorts of political problems. So for example, it is a concrete obstacle, constant obstacle when it comes for unions to actually take a very strong stance about defunding police, for example, about accountability and so on. So the first goal should be really to kick out cops unions from the labor movement. They don't belong there. Policemen are not really workers, and their interests are antagonistic with the interest of the rest of the working class, so, which is what unions are supposed to represent. So the first suggestion is AFL-CIO has refused for years to accept this demand that the anti-racist movement has constantly raised, that is to expel the police unions from the ranks. I do think this is an absolutely crucial step towards a serious participation of unions and the organized labor movement in the Black Rebellion. The second point I wanted to make is that we had several stances of expression of solidarity coming from unions, union locals to the rebellion, statements, symbolic walkouts, and so on. However, the entity of the problem that we are facing, that is white supremacy in the United States and its violent, brutal expression through the prison system and police brutality, requires something more than symbolic support. And from this viewpoint, I think that we need to really seriously open a conversation about how we can reach a point in which strikes, actual workplace strikes, can be called against police violence, against police brutality, against people of color. So blocking, literally, actually blocking production, distribution of goods, and so on and so on. I think this is the task that unions have. This is what we should ask from unions, to really work on creating the conditions, which are not in the law, because legally you cannot do this, the conditions for calling for strikes in protest, in solidarity with the movement, and in protest against police brutality.
That's great. Does anybody else want to jump in on this, or we move on? Seems like that was well covered. Eugene has I think a helpfully specific question to the New School context. I think it's it's a thoughtful question. How can students and scholars at predominantly white institutions, such as the New School, best serve the movement for racial justice without falling into some of the traps that Professor Ticktin mentioned? Any thoughts on that from anyone? Justin, please.
I mean, I think whenever something like this happens, with police violence, I think there's a kind of, well-intentioned instinct to kind of reflect on, for white folks, one's whiteness and one's privilege, and et cetera. Which is all well and good, but your reflection doesn't change anything but you, and maybe it doesn't even do that. I think really the only thing is action. So I would say, some examples of what that looks like is, plugging into whatever political organizations exist, either in the New School or outside of it in New York City, that are working on issues around Black liberation. Maybe you feel uncomfortable as a white person plugging into issues or organizations around Black liberation, but I would say, that's too bad. Maybe be uncomfortable for a little bit so that you can actually make a significant impact in this struggle. I think New School students and faculty, I think you should be pushing your unions to take stances for liberation. You should be talking in your union about how do we push for the AFL-CIO to disaffiliate cop unions. I think you can get out to protest safely with social distancing, wearing a mask. You should get involved in these social movements, get involved in an organization and do the stuff that needs to be done, whether that's working in spreadsheets or, bringing water to demonstrations or whatever, but get involved. That's what I would say. I mean, and read history. Don't read self-flagellating books about your whiteness. That's just my opinion.
That was helpful. Miriam, is that a hand?
Sure, yeah, that was great. I kind of just wanted to support that and say and put a plug for the anthropology students who came up immediately with a plan that followed along those lines, including getting the police off our campus, defunding any kind of idea of safety on campus. We need to remove the forms of surveillance. They were arguing for giving funding to Black students rather than other students, obviously to hiring more faculty of color, to changing the syllabi, all those kinds of things I think students can support, right? But I agree, of course, getting involved in the movements is key, but also changing our campus to make it reflect this, supporting healthcare on campus, supporting the caring structures instead of defunding them as has happened recently for us.
That's great, thanks. I'm gonna call on Emmanuel to ask a question himself. Emmanuel, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Please.
Thank you everybody for this great talk. I'm probably going to repeat in a way what Eugene just asked. My question was referring to this, and particularly what Professor Ticktin was mentioning, and regarding whiteness and connecting it to abolishing. Perhaps we need to abolish the category of whiteness itself, because the existence of whiteness is dependent on the subjugation of a racialized other. And in this way, there is no way to extract or preserve whiteness from white supremacy. And this, I think that the example of Amy Cooper is important here, because the idea that white liberalism has is that white supremacy is always with a hood and a member of the KKK, while in reality, it's more nuanced than that. And connecting it to the the issue at hand with the New School as a white space, perhaps to see how we can de-whiten in a way, or to abolish whiteness at the New School, particularly by also addressing issues of Eurocentrism. Not that Europe ideas are wrong per se, but when they are in a way portrayed in a way that they are superior to all others or universal, when they should perhaps be provincialized. Thank you.
Who'd like to take that? Miriam.
I mean, I can say something briefly. Yeah, no, thanks, Emma, for that. I mean, I think the idea would be, of course, to abolish white supremacy, but I think the danger of saying we're going to abolish whiteness is to keep the privilege in place and pretend that we're colorblind, right? And obviously we don't want to go there. So the question is, again, dismantling the structures, dismantling the hierarchies. And I do agree that that the Eurocentrism of the New School and SSR in particular has played an important role, I think, in precluding struggles and not talking about struggles for racial justice, and not teaching it, not hiring people that think about this, and so on. So I do think it is something we have to tackle.
That's great. I'm going to ask a question that's come out of a couple of people's comments, Udipta and Leo in particular, where they're asking just about the terminology. And, you know, academics love talking about terminology, but I think this can be a productive conversation. Udipta in particular asks, is there a difference in meaning between defund and abolition? And politically, do you think that's significant? Like, do either of you have thoughts on, any of you have thoughts on that, on those terminological choices, both the meaning and their political significance?
So, okay, I think, you know, like I said in my remarks, people who are not necessarily radicals, you know, are beginning to talk about and use these words and try to understand what they mean and how they're related, and how they're different. I mean, I consider myself an abolitionist. I want to see a world without police and prisons. I don't see defunding the police to necessarily be in conflict with that, because I think in order to get to that horizon of abolition, there are concrete steps we need to take in the here and now, to take away power from police and to build power in our communities, and to reinvest in our communities. I think people are counterposing these two words, defund and abolish, and I mean, I understand the instinct to do that, but I think, listen, there's people who are, you know, not socialists, radicals, whatever you want to say, and they're a little bit more comfortable with the word defund because it sounds a little bit more tangible and concrete. And there are people like me who want to see a completely different social order. But I mean, I see it like, you know, we're swimming in the same stream. We might swim together for a little bit, and we might part ways at some point, and that's okay. The point though is, I think we both have alignment in wanting to see change in the way police, you know, brutalize people. I want to maybe take it a little further, but that's okay. But yeah, defund is not in conflict with abolition, in my opinion. You need to defund in order to abolish.
That's helpful. Yeah, I'll just, my 2 cents are, Leo's question was also about, you know, is there any way to avoid misunderstandings? But I think he rightly anticipated the thought that there's no way to avoid possible misunderstandings. There's no magic words out there that somehow are, you know, immune to being either unintentionally or intentionally misinterpreted. So that's helpful. Let's have one last question. There's a great straightforward question from Sheena, just asking whether any of you think there are other countries that provide us with helpful models for other forms of social services that might better, you know, help society flourish without what we're seeing here today. Any thoughts, anyone?
Okay, I'm going to say a few words. I mean, yeah, obviously, I mean, we could, yes, of course, there are countries where things go better, also in terms, you know, how the police operates. The obvious and recurrent example is obviously, you know, Scandinavian countries where you know, the rate of incarceration is much lower, and so on and so on. At the same time, I think we should not fall into some kind of illusion, at least from my perspective, which is to say, I mean, there are some things that can be perhaps ameliorated within the US context in order to approximate more, you know, what happens in other liberal democracies, in contrast with which the United States are peculiar, let's say, you know, because of rate of incarceration, because, you know, the level of repression, and so on and so on. But we should also take into account that many of the examples we look at especially if there are, you know, examples taken, you know, because in the debate, usually like Scandinavia or Western Europe are used as an example, are also predicated upon a specific position of this country within the global orders. So in other words, what is possible to do within capitalist social relations in Sweden is not the same that is possible to do in a country like the United States. They don't have the same kind of, you know, role within the global order, and also like, you know, they don't have the same kind of social contradictions or population and so on and so on. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that, I mean, the reason why I'm really getting so passionate about the abolitionist perspective is that, in a sense, it is a perspective that invites us to not cultivate all too easy illusions about what can actually be achieved without radically transforming social relations, so without challenging capitalist social relations. And this also brings me back to the issue of, you know, the relationship between defunding and abolition. Of course, I mean, I totally agree with the way Justin puts the question. At the same time, I would also add, of course, you know, the task of abolitionists is that of, you know, within this debate, to insist that in any case, you know, this the moment in which reforms are disconnected from an abolitionist horizon, they run immediately the risk of giving birth to all kinds of, you know, different pathologies. So, for example, we defund the police, and then it's going to be privatized, or, you know, or private agencies will proliferate, and so on and so on. You know, we speak about police reform, and then it becomes just a cosmetic intervention, like body cameras. Clearly they didn't fix the problem. So from this is why I really think that the abolitionist perspective is so important, because it invites us to be a bit more realistic, you know, in spite of being in a sense utopian, because it looks at a possible horizon and future. It is also more realistic about what we can actually achieve without really transforming our way of organizing society. And I think this is very important in order to avoid what happened after 2015, which is, you know, sets of policy reforms that really didn't change anything, that were just cosmetic interventions.
Miriam, please.
I think that makes a ton of sense what Cinzia just said. And I was going to say, partly, I think our problem also is the scale at which we imagine. So, you know, if the global, and as everybody has said, the global is saturated by a militarized culture. It's not just a nation state. So to look for another nation state is to stay within that global system of militarization. And to use the language of nation state, another country that we could look to, is inherently, I think, just not radical enough. We're not going to get out of this system. But to support what Cinzia just said, there are real things happening on the ground. They just don't happen in the space of nation states. They happen in communities, and they happen in cities, and they happen in autonomous zones, and they happen, you know, in various other kinds of ways. And I think we need to recognize those as the spaces of political change. And once again, I want to push, as you said, there's a kind of a realistic and utopian, but I think in there, the political imaginary is incredibly important. And it's not something that's far-fetched. It's happening. It's on the ground. It's happening right around us. So.
Well, that's a good optimistic note to end on, as far as, you know, the little bit of optimism. Thank you all. This was wonderful. I really appreciate it. I think everybody involved really appreciates you all coming out for this. And thanks to the audience. So just for everyone out there, a video of this will be posted on the New School's YouTube channel, as will videos of all of the other events we've hosted. So if you want to check out any of those other ones, please just go to the YouTube channel for the New School and you'll see them there. Okay, thanks again, Cinzia, Miriam, and Justin. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you all.